It's a step in the right direction. Ukrainian and pro-Russian separatists agreed to a new ceasefire in just part of eastern Ukraine. Set to begin on Friday, the deal only affects forces facing each other in Luhansk. Both sides agreed to withdraw heavy weapons from the line of confrontation, but it's not yet clear how wide the demilitarized zone will be. In neighboring Donetsk, despite a deal reached on Monday to end the fighting over the contested airport, rocket barrages continued for hours in that area, all the same. However, it wasn't clear who was firing. These new deals are the latest attempts by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to reinforce a much violated ceasefire reached on September 5th. The developments come as NATO once again accused Russia of violating the Minsk agreement with the continued armament of separatists.
The problem has been that the separatists and Russia is not respecting the Minsk agreements. The ceasefire is violated, and for instance the Minsk agreements which states that we should have a monitoring of the international recognized borders of Ukraine has not been possible to implement because the work of those who are responsible for monitoring the borders have been severely undermined.
But with all the political wrangling and bouts of fighting, it's the civilians who are bearing the brunt of the crisis. On Monday, authorities in Kiev halted payments to municipal workers and pensioners in the east of the country, saying it will continue to do so until they come under government control. However, residents say the funding had stopped much earlier.
It has been 5 months since July that we haven't received salaries. Well, according to the existing information, it is blocked in the Mariupol treasury. We receive blank pay sheets and there is no money.
Nonetheless, the newly elected president of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic pledged to compensate citizens' pensions from the local budget. However, now with the newly agreed ceasefire on the table, civilians fear these agreements are little more than diplomatic talk, which could very much have the same fate as the Minsk truce.
Joining us over the phone from Germany is journalist and political activist Manuel Ochsenreiter. Now, Manuel, thank you for joining us. There's a new truce deal for Ukraine's Luhansk region set to take effect on Friday. Now, how optimistic should we be about this new deal?
It would be great if we could be optimistic, but I think we should be realistic because we have already a ceasefire since the Minsk agreement beginning of September last year. And that ceasefire was broke literally almost every single day since the contract of the ceasefire was signed. And I have been myself in the region several weeks ago, and there are constant fights, there are constant attacks. By the way, by the Ukrainian side, the battle of the airport of Donetsk is well known, but there are also other attacks by the Ukrainian army. We shouldn't forget to see both positions in that war. We have on the one side Ukraine with a very offensive region. Ukraine wants to take back all those regions where they say they lost it. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko even promised to get back Crimea. How this will happen, he didn't say, but he promised it as well. And we have on the other side the so-called separatists, the fighters in Donetsk and Luhansk, who have a defensive mission. What they do is they defend their territory, and they are not going over into attack. So this is the situation. I don't think the new ceasefire will change it a lot. We have to say that the Minsk agreement failed. That is, I think, the situation right now.
Now, as you've said, under the Minsk agreement, the ceasefire was broken every single day. Now, you've mentioned the Minsk agreement has failed. How will this deal differ from that?
Sorry?
You mentioned that the Minsk agreement failed. How, in your opinion, will this agreement differ from that one?
Yes, that's now the big question. The point is that the Ukrainian side has a very, very clear agenda, and this agenda says we will not accept at all any independence, any form of independence of Novorossiya, of the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, while they say we will not accept any Ukrainian state as it was before the war, as it was before the so-called Maidan protests. So the point is, as long the Kiev position is not flexible, as long Kiev doesn't get away, there will be no opportunity for a real peace and for a real ceasefire. That's the big point. I spoke to a lot of fighters of the so-called separatists in the region who said it was a mistake to do the ceasefire because we were on the push in that moment. In that moment, we were pushing forward and we were pushing back the Ukrainian army. Right now, the Ukrainian army uses the ceasefire to regroup, to reinforce the powers, and I met a lot of commanders, field commanders of the so-called separatists who told me that they expect a sort of winter offensive turned out by the Ukrainian army, and the signs look like that it will start again. We have to remember that right after the elections in Donetsk and Luhansk, November 2nd, right after those elections where I was there, where I witnessed, right after the Ukrainian side started tremendous attacks against bases of Luhansk and Donetsk. So I think as long Kiev doesn't move, and Kiev itself will not move as long the West doesn't tell Kiev to move, we shouldn't see Ukraine and Kiev and Petro Poroshenko as independent players in this geopolitical game. They are nothing else than those who get the orders, who get the commands from the West. They expect, they hope for NATO support. A Ukrainian analyst once told me the West supports in two cases, in elections and in war. Ukraine had its elections also 1 week before the elections in Luhansk and Donetsk, so the election time is over. That means it can be that now the time of war is beginning again.
Manuel,
So
sorry, I just want to go back to, sorry Manuel to interrupt you just there, I just want to go back to what you've just said. You've just mentioned that neither side will accept the terms of the other, so in your opinion there is a stalemate happening there. Now, in regards to the Minsk agreement, it's obviously been broken as you've said. Why has nobody mentioned that it has, you know, it's no longer in effect?
Oh, it was mentioned. It was simply not mentioned in Western mainstream media. Western mainstream media and Western mainstream politics were handling the Minsk agreement as it was kept by the Ukrainian side. But if you were just watching also the media of Donetsk and Lugansk, if you were there by yourself, as I was, you saw that it was heard. The problem is that the people, and I think as well also the politicians in Europe, in the NATO countries and in the EU countries, are not very well informed, are not very proper informed about what is going on in Donetsk and Lugansk in reality, that there are attacks against schools, against hospitals, against civilian areas, that the people there face a sort of terror bombing. These are attacks against civilians, because if we remember what happened while the Maidan and while President Yanukovych was in service, we remember all the protests by the West simply because of the Berkut units were brutal on the demonstrators. But what happened since that is much more. It's a real war, and from the view of Kiev, it is a war against its own population. But as I said, you will not find in Western mainstream media any proper coverage of this failure of the ceasefire, because the Western mainstream media is very close to the Western mainstream political position.
That's very good. Manuel Ochsenreiter, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry to cut you there.